There are places in the Appalachian Mountains where silence doesn't feel empty. It feels deliberate. Roads people stop using, houses no one repairs. Stories that only come up when the lights are low and the night feels too close. If you grew up there, you learn early which questions not to ask. Every story you're about to hear in True Appalachia Horror Stories is 100% true, verified through public records, local reports, and first-hand witness accounts. Some names have been changed to protect privacy, but the events themselves are completely real. Before we go on, like this video. It helps these stories reach more horror lovers like you. Comment where you're watching from. You're part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family is watching from. Afterward, comment which story hit you the hardest. And if you're new here, subscribe. Your support fuels this channel and helps bring even more true, unsettling stories to light. Some places remember everything, even when people try to forget. I didn't take the job because it was haunted or because I wanted a story. I took it because I needed steady money and because I didn't have anywhere else that felt like mine. The farmhouse sat in a low Appalachian hollow outside a place locals call Klein Branch, more a bend in the road than a town. The owner lived 2 states away and wanted it made livable so he could sell it in spring. He hired me through a friend of a friend. Cash, no benefits, no questions. I'd done carpentry most of my life. Decks, basements, roof patches, after storms, so the work didn't scare me. What scared me was the silence that came with it. The road down into the hollow was mud and gravel, cut into the hillside like an old scar. Trees crowded in so tight, their branches met overhead. And in winter, the fog settled there like a wet blanket that never got pulled back. Every morning, the place smelled like soaked leaves and cold iron. Even the sunlight looked tired, filtered through mist and bare branches. The farmhouse was set back from the road behind a line of hemlocks, half hidden like it didn't want attention. White paint peeling, porch sagging, a barn leaning at an angle that made my back hurt just looking at it. When I first unlocked the front door, the smell hit me hard. Mold, mouse droppings, old wood that had been damp for too long. The air inside was colder than outside, heavy and still, like it had been waiting. I moved into the front room because there wasn't much choice. The owner left a few things: a propane heater, some bottled water, a cheap folding cot. The rest was whatever the house decided to keep. A couch with its guts showing, a dining table with one leg shorter than the others, old curtains, stiff with grime, and everywhere, dust that clung to my boots and followed me around like a shadow. The first few days were normal enough. I worked from dawn until the light faded into the fog again. I patched holes in the roof, replaced rotten boards on the porch, cleared out the kitchen cabinets that smelled like dead insects. At night, I ate canned soup and listened to the wind comb through the trees. Sometimes I'd hear coyotes yipping far off up the ridge. Sometimes an owl would call once and go silent. The hollow swallowed sound in a way that made it hard to judge distance. On the 3rd day, I noticed the layout didn't make sense. It was subtle, just little things. A closet door in the hallway that opened onto a shallow space that felt too small for the width of the house. A section of wall in the bedroom that was noticeably thicker, like somebody had doubled it up. In the kitchen, the pantry had a back panel that looked newer than the rest, nailed in place with different nails. Old houses get remodeled. People build over problems instead of fixing them. I'd seen it 100 times. Still, when I stood in certain spots, especially near the stairs, I had the uneasy sense that the house had rooms it wasn't showing me. That night, I found the first photograph. It was tucked inside the back of a drawer in the living room side table, under a stack of yellowed receipts. A small black and white picture of the farmhouse taken from the road. Same porch, same hemlocks, but in the photo, there was a man standing in the upstairs window, face washed out by glare. He was holding something that caught the light. Metallic, maybe a camera, maybe just a mirror. On the back, in faded ink, a date, 1986. I slid it back where it was, told myself it was nothing. People leave photos behind all the time. The next day I worked in the attic. The attic access was a narrow pull-down staircase in the hallway ceiling. When I climbed up, the first thing I felt was the heat trapped under the roof, stale and damp at the same time. The insulation was old, gray, and clumped. Rafters were dark with water stains. The air smelled like mice and wet paper. I moved carefully, flashlight sweeping over boxes and broken furniture, an old rocking chair, a cracked trunk, stacks of magazines fused together by moisture. I was looking for leaks, for sagging beams, anything that needed reinforcement. That's when I found the cassette tapes. They were in a shoebox, tucked behind a beam, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag that had turned brittle with age. The box was heavy, full. Each tape had a label, handwritten room names and dates. Kitchen, September 14th, 1992. Front room, November 3rd, 1994. Hallway, February 18th, 1996. Some were newer, even into the early 2000s. I stood there in the dusty heat, turning one of the tapes over in my hand, feeling the grit on the plastic. People recorded family things, kids' voices, music, but these labels weren't birthdays or holidays. They were locations in the house. I brought the box down and set it on the dining table. The farmhouse didn't have power yet. I was still waiting on the utility company to clear the line down the hollow. So I used a little battery-powered cassette player I kept in my truck, mostly for old job site recordings and radio. The plastic was scratched, but it still worked. I put in the first tape I grabbed at random. Kitchen, September 14th, 1992. There was a click, then a soft hiss. For a while, all I heard was the vague sound of a room breathing, air moving, distant creaks. Then a chair scraped, a faucet ran. Someone hummed, out of tune, like they were doing dishes. It was normal, mundane, almost comforting. Then near the end, there was a sudden shift, like the recorder had been moved. The sound changed, closer to something hollow. And I heard a faint voice barely above the tape hiss, as if someone was speaking from inside a wall. I couldn't make out words. Just the shape of conversation, muffled and intimate. I told myself it was bleed-through. Old tapes can pick up radio signals. They can distort. They can lie. But that night, alone in the farmhouse with fog pressing against the windows, I listened to two more. Front room, November 3rd, 1994, was mostly footsteps, a creaking floor, the soft clink of glass like someone setting a jar down. Hallway, February 18th, 1996. Caught a single cough, then long stretches of silence punctuated by the faintest scratching. The scratching wasn't dramatic. It sounded like a fingernail on wood, testing a seam. I shut the player off and sat there, hands on my knees, listening to the real house around me. The old board settled, the propane heater ticked. Somewhere outside, something moved through leaves, and underneath it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that the tapes weren't just recordings of the house. I tried to be practical about it the next morning. I told myself the tapes were just an odd leftover, some previous owner with a hobby, maybe recording to catch burglars or pests. Maybe someone had a paranoia streak. Appalachia has its share of people who keep to themselves and don't trust the world. I'd met them. I understood it more than I wanted to admit. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about that muffled voice. So I did something I wish I hadn't. I recorded myself. I set the cassette player on the kitchen counter, pressed record, and went about making coffee on the propane stove. I talked out loud on purpose. Nothing important, just ordinary words. Need to fix the sink. Gotta call the utility company. I even laughed once, forcing it. Then I let the tape run for an hour while I worked in the living room. When I rewound and listened, it sounded exactly like what it was. Me in an empty farmhouse. My footsteps, the stove flame, the kettle beginning to rattle. No whispers, no scratching, nothing hidden. Relief washed over me, and with it embarrassment. I told myself I'd let the isolation get into my head. Then, around midday, while I was replacing trim near the hallway, I found something wedged behind the baseboard. A small scrap of paper folded into a tight square. The way people fold notes when they don't want them found. It was stained with something brown and old. When I unfolded it, the paper cracked at the creases. Inside was a list written in the same hand as the cassette labels. Front room. Good audio hallway. Too much pipe noise. Bedroom. He sleeps light attic. Do not step here. My throat went tight. The list didn't have dates, but it didn't feel old like the photo. The ink looked less faded. The paper smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, sharp and sour. I read the lines again, slower, like I could change what they said by staring hard enough. He sleeps light. There was only one person sleeping in that house now, me. I sat down on the dusty hallway floor with the paper in my hand, trying to steady my breathing. I thought about the nearest neighbors, miles away up the ridge. I thought about the road in and out, how a vehicle would have to pass my truck to reach the house. I told myself no one could be living here without me noticing, but the house had those thick walls, those odd spaces, that pantry panel that didn't match. I got up and checked every door and window again, my hands moving automatically, like if I did it in the right order, I could undo the feeling that something had shifted. Nothing was unlocked. Nothing was broken. In the afternoon, fog rolled in heavier than it had all week, turning the windows into pale gray squares. The hollow outside disappeared. I worked with my head down, nails in my mouth, hammering too hard. The sound was comforting. A human sound. When dusk came early, I lit lanterns and tried to keep myself busy by sorting the tapes. That's when I noticed something that made my skin go cold. At the bottom of the shoebox were 3 tapes with newer labels, written in the same handwriting but on cleaner tape. Fresh masking tape, not the yellowed kind. Front room 1/, the date was smudged, unfinished. Hallway 1/, also unfinished. And one more, bedroom Trish. Tonight, I stared at that last label for a long time, feeling the house press in around me. My hands went numb. It would have been easy to tell myself it was a joke, but there was nobody to joke with. There was nobody who knew I'd found the box, unless someone else had been here recently, unless someone was still here. I stood up so fast, the chair legs scraped loud against the wood. The sound echoed, then got swallowed by the fog outside. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the pantry. The back panel had always looked newer. Now, I was close enough to see small pry marks along the edges, like it had been removed and put back more than once. The nails weren't fully seated. Some sat slightly proud, as if they'd been pulled and tapped back in. I wedged my pry bar in and pulled carefully. The panel came loose with a soft crackle of old wood fibers. Behind it was darkness and a smell that made my eyes water. Stale sweat, damp insulation, and something sour, like old food. A narrow cavity ran behind the kitchen wall, just wide enough for a person to move if they turned sideways. I could see studs and wiring. And beyond that, another panel. This one leading toward the hallway. My flashlight beam caught something on the dirt-packed floor of the cavity. A cigarette butt fresh enough that the paper was still white. And beside it, a small pile of cassette tapes, blank ones still in plastic wrap. I backed away, breathing shallow, trying not to make noise. My mind kept searching for an explanation that didn't exist. Squatters, someone using the house for storage, someone hiding from something. But the note behind the baseboard wasn't about hiding. It was about listening. I didn't call the police. I'm not proud of that, I just couldn't. Not without sounding like I'd gone crazy in the fog. I convinced myself that if someone was in the walls, they'd be gone by the time anyone arrived. And worse, if they heard me calling, they'd know I'd found them. So I did what felt safest in the moment. I left. I grabbed my keys, my coat, my phone, and the shoebox of tapes without thinking. I didn't shut off the lanterns. I didn't tidy up. I didn't even put on different boots. I just walked out the front door into the fog like a man waking from a bad dream. And I drove down that muddy road with my headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through gray. I stayed in Laurel Fork that night at a motel that smelled like bleach and cigarette smoke. I locked the deadbolt and shoved a chair under the handle, like that would fix something inside me. In the morning, the owner wouldn't answer my calls. When he finally texted back 2 days later, it was just, "Don't go back in there. I'll handle it. No questions, no surprise." That was the part that ruined me more than the cavity in the wall, because it meant someone had known. Maybe everyone had known. Maybe the farmhouse wasn't abandoned in the way I'd believed. Maybe it was simply ignored. The way people ignore things in the mountains when dealing with them feels harder than living around them. I never went back for my tools. I still have the shoebox of tapes. It sits in a plastic bin in my closet like a rotten thing I can't throw away. I've tried to listen to them again, but I can't make it through more than a few minutes before my skin prickles and my throat tightens. Sometimes I wonder if there's a tape in there with my name on it. Sometimes I wonder if there's one labeled with a date I haven't lived yet. And on certain nights, when fog presses against my windows and the house creaks in that slow, settling way, I catch myself listening for sounds that don't belong to me. Not because I think I'm hearing ghosts, because I learned in that hollow that you can be alone and still not be unobserved. They felt like the house recording itself. I grew up in a place that doesn't show up on most maps unless you zoom in far enough to see the thin gray lines. We called it Denton Fork, though the official name on the post office sign was something longer and older that nobody used. It sat in an Appalachian hollow where fog slid in every evening like it had a routine. And the hills leaned close enough to make you feel watched even when you were alone. When I was a kid, There was one rule everybody followed without ever saying it out loud. Don't take Buck Run Road after dark. Buck Run wasn't a highway or even a real road in the way outsiders would imagine. It was a narrow ribbon of cracked pavement that cut behind the ridgeline, past old family cemeteries and abandoned coal tips, then dropped back down near the river. In daylight, it was just another shortcut. At night, it felt like a tunnel made of trees and silence. Adults wouldn't tell you why. They'd just say it wasn't worth it. If you pressed, they'd change the subject or give you the kind of look that made your stomach tighten. The only details I ever caught were bits and pieces. Someone vanished out there, years ago. A man and his truck. No trace, no body. Just gone into the woods like the woods had swallowed him. I left Denton Fork at 18 and didn't come back for a long time. I did what people from places like that do when they're trying to outrun the smallness. Took jobs in bigger towns, rented apartments that smelled like other people's cooking, tried to build a life that didn't depend on family names and unspoken rules. Then my mother got sick. Not sudden at first, just a slow tightening around her life. Doctor visits, medications, the quiet fear in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. When she finally passed, it was in the spring, when rain soaked the mountains and the creeks ran brown with mud. I drove back for the funeral, stayed a few days to help my dad sort paperwork and empty out a house that suddenly felt too big. On the last night, I left late. Dad offered for me to stay one more night. I said I couldn't. I had work in the morning, and honestly, being in that house made me feel like I was wearing someone else's skin. The grief came in waves there. Her coffee cup still in the cabinet, her coat on the hook by the door, the faint smell of her lavender soap clinging to towels. So I got in my car and drove. It was raining hard enough that the wipers couldn't keep up. The kind of heavy Appalachian rain that turns everything into a smear. Headlights stretching into long white ribbons, trees becoming dark walls. Fog hung low on the road, and my tires hissed over wet pavement. I took the main route at first, but a washed-out section forced a detour. The only alternative was Buck Run Road. I sat at the intersection for a full minute with my blinker ticking, watching rainwater run down the signpost like sweat. I could have turned around and added another hour to the drive. I didn't. I told myself I wasn't a kid anymore. I told myself it was just a road. Buck Run greeted me the same way it always had. Trees pressing in, the shoulder dropping off into darkness, the road curving so tightly, it felt like it was trying to fold back on itself. Water poured off the hillsides, cutting thin streams across the pavement. Every so often, my headlights caught the pale shape of an old mailbox or a leaning fence post. About 5 miles in, the engine sputtered. It was subtle at first, like a hiccup. Then it did it again, harder. The dashboard lights blinked. I eased off the gas, trying not to panic. And the car lost power like something had reached in and pinched the life out of it. I coasted as far as I could and rolled into an old pull-off I remembered from childhood. A patch of gravel where people used to park to fish the creek. The rain hammered the roof. The woods on both sides were so dark they looked solid. I turned the key again. The engine clicked, tried, then died. No cell service? Of course. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, listening to the rain and the slow ticking of cooling metal. The air inside the car smelled like wet fabric and old fast food wrappers I'd forgotten to throw away. My breath fogged the windshield. That's when the pickup truck passed. It came from behind me, headlights washed yellow by rain. An older model, square body, dull paint, no shine. It slowed as it went by, not stopping, just easing down to a crawl like the driver was looking in. But when it passed the beam of my headlights, I saw the cab. Empty, no silhouette, no movement. Just a dark bench seat and rain streaking the windows. I felt a cold flush run through my arms. My brain tried to correct it. Maybe I couldn't see the driver through the rain. Maybe the glare hid them. But the inside looked vacant in a way that didn't feel like a trick of light. The truck continued on, taillights fading into the curve ahead, swallowed by trees. A few minutes later, it came back, from the opposite direction this time, turning the same bend, slowing the same way, the same truck, the same dull paint, the same empty cab. It rolled past my stalled car like it had all the time in the world. And as it disappeared again, the rain seemed to get louder, like the mountain was leaning in to listen. I sat there, with my phone clenched in my hand, watching my own reflection tremble in the black glass of the windshield. I told myself there was a simple reason, but deep in my chest, something old and instinctive stirred. Something I remembered from childhood, from the way adults avoided this road without explanation. And for the first time in years, I wished I'd listened. The third time it passed, I stopped trying to explain it away. The truck appeared out of the rain like it had been waiting for the right moment. Same slow roll, same deliberate hesitation at the edge of the pull-off. It didn't stop, just crawled by like it was measuring me, like it was checking if I was still there. I leaned forward until my forehead almost touched the windshield, trying to see anything. Hands on the wheel, a face, even a shape shifting in the dark. Nothing. The cab stayed hollow. The passenger seat looked dry compared to everything else outside, like no one had been sitting there. When the taillights vanished, I realized my body was shaking. Not from cold, from the kind of fear that doesn't spike and fade. It settles in, quiet and steady, and makes you feel stupid for being alive. I tried the ignition again. Click, click, nothing. I popped the hood and stepped out into the rain. Immediately soaked, the air hit me with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. The woods sounded alive, water dripping off branches, the creek nearby running fast, an occasional far-off call of something I couldn't place. Everything echoed strangely in the hollow, bouncing off the valley walls. Under the hood, the engine bay was just a black mess of metal and hoses. I didn't know enough to diagnose anything in the dark, in the rain, with my hands numb. I pretended I did anyway, moving my flashlight beam like I was searching for something obvious. That's when I heard tires on wet pavement again. I froze. The truck approached from behind, slower than before. I didn't look up right away. I stayed bent over the engine, rainwater running off my hair and down my neck, pretending I hadn't noticed. The headlights washed over my back, bright enough to cast my shadow into the engine bay. The truck stopped, not beside me, not in the lane. It stopped behind my car, blocking the pull-off like it meant to keep me there. I turned slowly. The truck sat a few yards back, idling. Or at least, it looked like it should have been idling. But I didn't hear an engine. No rumble, no vibration. Just the rain. The cab was still dark, empty. My throat tightened so hard it hurt. I took a step toward it, then stopped. Every instinct screamed not to get closer. I raised my flashlight and pointed it through the windshield. The beam lit the inside for a split second. Cracked vinyl seat, dusty dashboard, a faint outline of something hanging from the rearview mirror. Then the light caught the mirror itself, and for a moment I saw my own face reflected back, wide-eyed, pale. Something moved behind me in the reflection. Not a shape outside the truck, not in the woods, inside the cab. I whipped the flashlight back to the truck interior, sweeping the beam across the seats. Nothing. The cab looked empty again, as if the movement had been my imagination, or a trick caused by rainwater sliding down glass. But my skin was crawling. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my teeth. I backed away from the truck toward my car, keeping the flashlight trained on the windshield. The truck didn't move. It just sat there, rain streaking down its hood, the outline of it dark and patient. I scrambled into my car and locked the doors with shaking fingers. The sound of the locks clicking felt too small to matter. I sat there clutching the steering wheel, breathing shallow, watching the truck through the rain. Minutes passed. 10 maybe. The truck stayed. Then, without any suddenness, it began to roll forward. Slow, smooth. It pulled up alongside my driver's side window. My pulse went syrup thick. I could barely breathe. The passenger window of the truck was level with mine now, close enough that I could see water beads on the glass. I raised my flashlight and aimed it inside. The beam caught the seat again, the dash, the cracked steering wheel. And on the driver's side floorboard, there was a pair of boots. Mud-caked, heavy work boots, positioned like someone had stepped out of them and left them behind. The laces were undone, tongues splayed open, no legs above them, no body. Just boots sitting there like a leftover thought. The truck kept rolling, passing me with that same careful slowness, then continuing up the road until the taillights disappeared into the rain and the trees. I sat there afterward with my mouth open, trying to make myself inhale. My brain raced to explain it. Boots left behind, someone crouched low, a prank, a squatter, but nothing fit. Nothing fit the quiet, controlled way the truck moved. Nothing fit the fact that it had been circling like it knew exactly where I was. Sometime later, close to dawn, the rain eased and the sky began to lighten to a bruised gray. The fog lifted slightly, revealing the wet shine of the road. I heard a distant engine and felt a surge of relief so sharp it almost made me cry. A county truck, one of the road guys, pulled into the pull-off. A real person stepped out, cap pulled low, jacket dripping. "You all right?" he called, voice muffled by the damp air. I nodded too fast. "Car died." He looked at my car, then up the road. "You been here all night?" "Yeah." My voice came out thin. "Did you see a pickup pass through here? Older one?" His expression shifted. Not surprise. Something closer to resignation. He scratched his jaw, eyes scanning the tree line like he didn't want to look at me too long. "What color?" he asked. "Dull gray. Maybe green. Square body." He exhaled slowly. "Ain't nobody drives buck run in weather like this." "I saw it," I said, and heard the edge in my own voice. "It passed me 3, 4 times." He didn't argue. He just looked at the road again, then back at me with a quiet kind of pity. "Listen," he said softer. "Get your car towed. Don't wait out here." In town later, when my car was finally running again, I asked my dad about it. I didn't tell him everything. I just asked about the old stories, about the man who vanished. Dad's hands went still on his coffee mug. His eyes dropped to the table like the wood grain suddenly mattered. After a long pause, he said, "You shouldn't have taken that road." "Who was it?" I asked. He swallowed. Name was Everett Sloan. "What happened to him?" Dad's jaw tightened. He disappeared. Folks searched, found nothing. But they never found his truck, I said, voice barely above a whisper. Dad finally looked up at me. His eyes were tired in a way I hadn't noticed at the funeral. That's the thing, he said. They did. My stomach flipped. What do you mean? They found it years later, he said. Down in the creek bed, wedged under rocks. Flood must have moved it. Cab was empty. No body, no prints. He paused, then added, like he couldn't stop himself. They found his boots in it, like he'd taken them off. That night on Buck Run wasn't a ghost story. I'm careful with that word. I don't claim things I can't prove, but I know what it did to me. Now, whenever it rains hard and the fog sits low in the valleys, I catch myself checking my mirrors too often. I avoid backroads even when they're faster. And sometimes, in the quiet moments right before sleep, I picture those boots sitting on the floorboard, empty above them, like somebody stepped out of their life and left the rest behind. The worst part is this. I can't tell if the truck was circling to warn me away, or if it was only there because, for a few hours on a wet Appalachian night, I was finally alone enough to be noticed.
If today's story touched a quiet corner of your heart, if for a moment you felt like someone was standing close to you, then remember you are not alone. To hear more terrifying whisper in the depth of the night, subscribe to our channel Nightmare Whisper, because every story is not just about fear, it leaves behind a feeling. Thanks for watching, and one more thing, we'll meet again tomorrow night when the darkness has grown a little deeper.